Thank you all for joining. So just before we kick off, a couple upcoming to and through events that I wanted to mention that we hope you all will join us for. We've got a couple of data collaboratives coming up in June and August. And if people are unfamiliar with data collaborative, that's a space that we host at to and through about once a month. That's very interactive. It's online, but it's a place for researchers to come together and talk about new work that's happening using education related data in the city of Chicago. So we've got a couple of very cool presentations coming up in that space. And then I'm really excited about our next research spotlight in July. We really hope you'll join us for this one. It's Teach Plus, and they're going to be talking about their work around best practices for improving teacher diversity through all different parts of the teacher pipeline. So definitely extremely relevant and important work that we're excited to hear about. I also want to mention that after today's presentation, we are going to have an optional about 30-minute post-event discussion, and this will be just a casual place for us to come together and talk about the research that we just heard about. No need to, it's very low stress, no need to prepare or feel like you have to have brilliant things to say. It's really just a place to process and talk about the interesting research that we just heard about. So we hope you'll join us for that. And we'll be dropping a link to that in the chat towards the end of this session. And then lastly, I just want to welcome Hal Woods, who's the Chief of Policy at Kids First Chicago. He, in that role, works with parents and school district leadership to empower communities and shape education policies to better support students and families. Before joining Kids First Chicago, he worked at Chicago Public Schools in a variety of roles. Most recently, he was the executive director of the Office of Innovation and Incubation and the director of strategy in the CEO's office. And prior to working at CPS, Hal served as advisor to the president at the Chicago Transit Authority. So with that, I will hand it over.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm just going to bring up the presentation. Wonderful. So just first and foremost, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about our work, Kids First Chicago. This was an incredibly important report to us. I'll talk a little bit about some of the origins behind it, but it was really an opportunity that started as conversations with our parents in our network, as well as some staff discussion around we continue to see in the headlines year after year about CPS's continued enrollment decline. And so we really wanted to, first and foremost, just to help answer this question for our parents, was to understand what are the main drivers behind that. Are people leaving CPS, families leaving CPS, and they're going to other options within the city of Chicago, non-public options, or something else happening? And so very excited to share the underlying research for that report, but also to give a kind of a preview into part two of that report, working with our parents to devise solutions to address some of the main barriers that are identified in the report. So I think first and foremost, important to highlight that CPS, and I think this is not going to be a surprise to everyone here, but CPS has just seen tremendous academic gains over the last 20 years and beyond. Very unique in terms of the contribution within the urban education school district landscape. I think one of the things that we don't have here is the freshman on track rate, which I know has just been a huge benefit to the district, but to the Chicago education ecosystem overall, as a correlation with this rising graduation rate. So we've seen a tremendous increase in graduation rates across the city of Chicago through CPS students for all races and ethnicities thus far. So I think an important kind of framing slide before we jump into some of the additional research. However, over that same time period, we've also seen just a tremendous enrollment decline. We had a peak enrollment of about 438,000 students back in 2002-2003 school year. We've now lost over 100,000 students at Chicago Public Schools since then, losing on average about 10,000 students almost per year. So this is an incredibly, I think, important juxtaposition of seeing really incredible academic outcomes for students as evidenced by the graduation rate. But at the same time, we've seen this tremendous decline in CPS enrollment. This is something that we're seeing throughout the country. This is not a unique situation for Chicago. We've seen it in Boston, Los Angeles, even cities like Austin, Texas that are increasing in population. We see similar public school enrollments declines as well. So we first wanted to understand what are some of the main drivers behind this enrollment decline. Is this a situation where families are choosing to go to non-public options, or is there something else happening here? And what we identified really was that we have just seen a tremendous decline in the number of school-age children in the city of Chicago. You go back to 1980, we had upwards of almost 700,000 students in the city of Chicago. Roughly 60% of those students were attending public schools. That market share, that proportion of students who attend public schools has actually gone up. But at the same time, you see this tremendous decline actually in public school enrollment. So you see that kind of narrowing of the gap where CPS is taking on more market share and has actually increased their market share by about 20% going back to 1980. But you still see this decline in enrollment that's really being driven by just a reduction in the number of school-age children in the city of Chicago. This next slide here, I think, helps kind of paint the picture in a slightly different way, but just seeing in that green bar, the market share for Chicago Public Schools, again, going back to 1960, 60%, increasing steadily up to 2010, 2018, where we saw about 80% of school-age children attending public schools. But again, that enrollment is declining primarily because there's just fewer children in the city of Chicago. I think also important to highlight here, 8 out of 10 Latinx AO and Black students school-age students attend a CPS versus a non-public or a homeschool option. Whereas with white students, it's about 5 out of 10. And so I don't have the data right here, but it's in the report where we had just a significant decline. We had about 500,000 white school-age children in the city of Chicago going back to 1960. Now we have 50,000. So it's just a 90% decline in the number of white school-age children in the city of Chicago. We saw a significant uptick in Black students from 1960 to 1980. That has been decreasing steadily ever since. And then we did see that surge in the 90s of Latinx AO students coming to the district, but that has started to slow as well. And so we'll get into a bit of that as we go further on the presentation. So we talk about what is driving the enrollment decline. We know that it's not families that are leaving Chicago Public Schools for non-public options. I think we've all seen a lot of literature, recent news reports about there has been a change. Certainly, I think that people have kind of pointed to the pandemic as potentially causing some shifts. But by far, looking at CPS's own data, looking at other cities around the country, the declines that we're seeing, while there might be a slight uptick as a result of the pandemic, potentially schools being in person versus remote, the main factors that are driving this enrollment decline are just fewer children available, first and foremost. So we look at 3 main factors. The first is declining births in the city of Chicago. So we think about this as a structural change that's happened, really even going a little over 10 years ago. You had 30,000 kindergartners coming into the system within CPS every year. Now that number is roughly 22,000. We have 11,000 fewer babies being born in the city of Chicago than we did back in 2009. That didn't happen overnight, right? It was a steady decline going from 2009 until present, but just kind of shows where that structural that deficit is, where every single year there's going to be 11,000 or more fewer students that are going to be available to go to public schools. So as you think about a CPS enrollment decline of 10,000 students roughly annually, you think about that 80% market share that CPS is capturing with school-age children in Chicago, that 11,000 to 10,000 makes a whole lot of sense in terms of what we're seeing each successive school year from a decade prior. I would also acknowledge that this is not a uniquely Chicago situation. I think the last data that I saw from 2021 showed that the birth rate, and both the birth rate and the number of live births in America was the lowest that it had been since 1979. So we are now, we no longer are keeping up with the replacement rate. So we have a declining population in America. Chicago is experiencing that as well, and so are other school districts. Digging into specifically around the Latinx AO population in Chicago. So we know that across America, certainly in Chicago as well, the Latinx AO population growth has had a significant role in increasing the US population, just as it did in Chicago in the 1990s and early 2000s as well. But that growth is slowing. So part of the reasons that we identified in the report as a reason behind that declining growth is first is declining birth rates. So not just the number of the actual number of births, but actually birth rates. If you go back to the early 2000s, late 1990s, Latina women were having roughly, it was about 95 to 100 babies per 1,000 women. That has now gone down to about 66. So we're seeing almost I think to think about another way would be for every Latina woman having 3 children, now they're having about 2 children. I think there's certainly some positive reasons behind that change. We know that looking through survey data, some other publicly available information, certainly Latina women are staying in school for longer, they're having families later. There's less of an economic reason. There's reasons for why Latino women are having babies at a different rate than they were previously. We also know that childcare costs are also a big contributing factor to this as well. There was a New York Times survey in 2018 where cost was cited across Latino women as being the primary factor for why they were having fewer children. So again, there's some good and some bad, I think, in terms of what's driving that declining birth rate. But certainly it's having a contributing factor to what we're seeing here in Chicago. Second main reason is declining in migration from Latin America, particularly from Mexico. So when we were having a declining Black population in Chicago in the 1990s, it was kind of, it wasn't as obvious to all of us because we had this incredible surge of Latinx AO population happening at the same time. I think there's about 230,000 Latinx AO in migration in the 1990s to the early 2000s. Which is kind of evidenced by Chicago's kind of peak in enrollment at 438,000 in the 2000-2003 school year. However, we've seen a significant decline in migration. We all, I think, look at the headlines. We see immigration policy as being certainly a contributing factor, particularly under the prior administration. But we've also identified, some of the economic reasons for why families left and came from Mexico to Chicago have changed dramatically. We had the economic shocks that existed in Mexico in the 80s and the 90s don't exist. And there's been a much more healthy and stable economy in Mexico, which is, again, kind of leading to fewer incentives for families to actually move here. As we identified previously, families are having smaller families, so there's not as much of an economic need to potentially migrate to Chicago. We particularly call out Mexico because roughly 3/4 of all Latinx AO population in Chicago is of Mexican or Mexican-American descent. We have seen, I think we saw from the most recent census, that Chicago's Latinx AO population actually did increase by about, I think it was roughly about 50,000 residents from 2010 to 2020. But at that same time period, there was a decline in the number of Mexican-American and Mexican in migration to Chicago. And so we're seeing that immigration coming from other Latin American countries, but because Chicago's Latinx AO population is proportionally Mexican and Mexican-American, when we see that in-migration slowing from Mexico, it has a disproportionate impact on Chicago. And finally, gentrification. There was actually some wonderful work that was done by UIC a couple of years ago that took a look at the majority Latin XAO communities across the city of Chicago and the changing demographics that are happening there. Our report did a special call out for Humboldt Park, Logan Square, and Pilsen, where you see communities where there's a population with low home ownership, high unemployment rates, higher than average unemployment rates. And when you have basically folks moving into a particular community, rezoning, going from multifamily units to single family homes, the impact that then causes on property values, rent increases for residents that live in those communities is significant. These are residents who own the businesses, who work at the community organizations in these communities, and they're increasingly being pushed out based on the pricing and the ability to live in those communities. So we have identified kind of this lack of kind of equitable development policies that have really contributed to our increased gentrification as being a major reason for why certain communities have seen disproportionate impacts when it comes to enrollment at their schools. I think gentrification is a tough thing to study because it's not always indicative of a person or a family or a household or resident leaving Chicago. They might just move to a different community within Chicago. But ultimately, that does impact the community in which that family or that resident was ultimately living. I think one of the most kind of startling statistics that we saw from the most recent regional analysis from Chicago Public Schools was that we have seen a 22% enrollment decline in the Pilsen and Little Village community areas, which is one kind of annual regional analysis region, but a 22% decline over the last 5 years. And when you think about the confluence of those three factors, declining birth rates, decrease in migration, and gentrification, and we've particularly seen in Pilsen, this is the manifestation of that, where you've seen just significant enrollment declines within the Pilsen Little Village schools, particularly at the elementary level, that's now starting to translate into enrollment declines at the high school level as well. Switching over to Blackout Migration as a significant reason behind Chicago's enrollment decline. We have lost as a city over 250,000 Black residents since 2000. I think that the big kind of aha moment for all of us in the city was the 2010 census, where we saw that significant decline kind of as most kind of evidence initially. But again, kind of going back to that notion of you've got 8 out of 10 Black students, 8 out of 10 Latinx AO students attending Chicago public schools. When we lose those families, when we lose those residents, it has a huge impact on CPS. So again, you can see here just that that population decline that's manifested over the last 15 to 20 years. It started even earlier than this in terms of going back to 1980, in terms of the Black population starting to decrease after this kind of the second wave of the Great Migration as well. What are some of the reasons why Black families are leaving Chicago? There's been a lot of great literature and research done on this by some of our local higher education institutions. UIC had a tremendous report back in 2020 trying to understand what were some of the main reasons behind the Black exodus. And again, it's a combination of factors. It's employment, work opportunities, housing came up significantly, schooling, education. Certainly the school closures were disproportionately impacted Black communities, access to healthcare, food deserts, this kind of combination of factors that have contributed to, again, this over 250,000 Black residents leaving over the last 20 years. One of the things that we looked at, or sort of our own kind of original kind of census research, was looking at employment rates. So we looked at the experience for Black Cook County residents, Latinx AO Cook County residents, and white Cook County residents, and the employment rates looking at the changes from 1990 to 2020. And you can see for Latinx AO residents, going back to 1990, that gap was significant, but it is significantly also narrowed going into 2015, 2020. For white residents of Cook County, you actually have a higher employment rate than the surrounding county areas. But for Black Cook County residents, that gap is still incredibly stubborn. And so we believe, when we talk to families that Parents in Our Network got us in touch with, who've left Chicago, particularly for Black Chicagoans, employment rates come up as a significant reason. The ability to get employed came up as a significant reason for why they left. So that's we heard that, we researched it, and this is what we came up with in terms of, we see that stubborn gap for employment rates. And so we believe that's a significant contributing factor to why Black Chicagoans are leaving. The good news is that for Black Chicagoans that are leaving, they're not going terribly far. And so we see disproportionately Black Chicagoans who have left have stayed in Illinois. So again, kind of going back to that surrounding counties chart that we showed on the previous slide, you see that Black Chicagoans are staying relatively close to Chicago. Certainly a number of folks are moving to Northwest Indiana, to southeast Wisconsin. We see some folks moving to the south. Again, I think we've all kind of seen in some of the media reports about kind of the reverse Great Migration, Texas, Florida, Georgia, other places as well. But the vast majority are within this kind of Illinois, southeast Wisconsin, northwest Indiana, which gives us hope and promise that those families, if we can change the conditions that cause folks to leave Chicago, potentially we can recruit them back to have families here in Chicago as well. I'm going to so I think this was an incredibly kind of exciting foundational report. As we were kind of writing the report, we thought about, should we try to combine this essentially into one report where we kind of talk about, here's the kind of the foundational information about why families, what is causing CPS's enrollment decline? What are some of the main reasons for why that's happening? Also, why does that matter? I think, we spend more time in the report than I did here today, but really kind of outlining that as CPS continues to lose enrollment, that ultimately is going to mean fewer resources available to CPS. We know that the state funding formula gives money to CPS based on the number of students that CPS serves. We also know that CPS gives money to individual schools based on the number of students that are enrolled at those schools. And so fewer students means fewer resources for our students. We also know that CPS has lots of fixed costs. They've got fixed costs in teachers and personnel. They got fixed costs in buildings and maintenance. And so the rubber's going to, potentially meet the road there, right? We've got these fixed costs. You've got declining revenue coming in that's being triggered by this declining enrollment. And that creates a very challenging situation, certainly for CPS. What does that look like at the school level in terms of not having resources? I think we've got plenty of folks here, educators, former educators, current educators, principals, administrators, who would understand that you've got declining resources. That means from the student experience, fewer electives, fewer opportunities to participate in extracurricular activities. that has a negative student experience for teachers. It might mean stressed staff. You've got staff that are teaching, potentially multiple grades, multiple subjects, less planning time to work amongst each other as collaborative. And certainly for principals, it means less resources to be able to have additional staff, parent workers, lunchroom attendance. And so it kind of just puts more strain on the schools, certainly. And so I think, in addition to kind of understanding the why this is happening, I think it's important to also highlight why it matters. And so we started engaging with our parents even before we released this report, just to start to kind of understand, to talk with them about what are some of the barriers that they've seen at their, within their own communities. What are some of the experience that they've had in terms of lower enrollment? How has that affected their child or even their grandchildren's experience at those schools? And what we're really working towards is having a series of workshops, kind of like, I would call them kind of like qualitative focus groups amongst parents kind of across the city of Chicago, to understand what are some of the solutions that we can do, that we can implement, that we can recommend to ultimately address some of these systemic barriers that are causing families to leave the city of Chicago. The way that we've designed this work is pretty novel for our organization, and I'm excited to share it with this group here today. It's really something that we have applied. There's a project that we're working on with CPS called Accountability Redesign. And the notion is, when you're thinking about engaging stakeholders on a topic, how do you do so in a way that also brings stakeholders into the process of actually designing that stakeholder engagement plan? So not just, Kids First staff, myself, and the rest of the team sitting back and kind of making decisions about, hey, how are we going to recruit parents? How are we going to compensate parents? How are we going to design these workshops? How are we going to do this work? We actually have brought in parents into the planning and design process. We kind of call it like our enrollment kind of design team. We have about 8 to 12 parents that we meet with on a biweekly basis to work through all these things that traditionally, I think organizations like ours would have decided on their own. And so this goes all the way from, how are we going to design these workshops? So what do the workshops look like? What are going to be the data collection tools that we use, the language that we use, how accessible is it? How relatable is it going to be for our parents that are going to be able to see it? Everything being offered in dual language. Certainly, of course, devising a recruitment plan with our parents, having those parents actually help us with the active recruitment for these workshops as well. When we get into implementation, our design team is going to be really they will be often at the table themselves participating in these workshops. They're also going to be helping to recruit parents to bring their voices into the conversations as well. And then that kind of third phase is, once we have, and I'll go ahead and go through the workshop phasing in a second, but once we have the data we've collected from the workshops, really working with the design team to help kind of put the final polish on the final report, have them put their stamp of approval in terms of what those recommendations are going to be. And then I think to create a plan, not only to share the report, but to also kind of inject parents who participate in this process into kind of existing quality of life planning, or how do we kind of get the recommendations implemented? So what's the toolkit that we can give to parents, where it's not just like, okay, we've released the second report, here's these recommendations, hopefully policymakers and decision makers listen to us, but how are we going to actually build kind of an advocacy campaign to actually realize some of the recommendations that parents put forward through the second report? I'll give kind of a brief kind of snapshot of what we're trying to accomplish in each successive workshop. The first one is really around parents being able to identify barriers related to enrollment. So we put out what are kind of looking at census data, doing some original research around employment rates, reading other research reports. What are some of the barriers that are causing slower growth in the Latinx community, out-migration in the Black community? But I think to really kind of understand, does that align with what people have actually experienced, right? Does that align with what parents have seen in their communities? That's going to be a really important focus of that first workshop, is to understand, are these the right barriers, right? If we list those kind of 6 to 8, or like the top 10 barriers, are those the right ones to be focusing on if we start to work collectively to design solutions to address those barriers? I think also we're going to do some prioritization. I often hear, actually it's the head of the civic committee, talking about like, the concern about boiling the ocean, right? So we don't want to boil the ocean. We want to prioritize the barriers that families feel are the most impactful for us being able to keep families here, and to bring families back to Chicago that might have potentially left. And so we want to ask our parents to help us prioritize those barriers before we kind of start to prototype solutions. Workshop 2 is going to be really kind of a deeper understanding of what the challenges are. So like, let's say that parents choose an issue like housing. Housing as a category is a very, very broad category. So if we wanted to kind of dig deeper into, well, is it the affordability? Is it the ability to get a mortgage? Is it availability? Is there housing stock available? are there situations where there's barriers that folks in this room might not see, but we have to submit a housing application? Is there an excessively high fee that's related with that? Does that format to be submitted online? So there's a digital divide potential issue of people being able to participate that. So it's going to be really like an hour and a half focus group kind of qualitative data collection discussion to really understand what are the barriers that people have experienced with those. So we identify the priorities in workshop 1, but then a deeper level conversation in workshop 2 to understand what are the experiences that people will have had. So then when we come back in workshop 3, we can actually start to present solutions that directly address the barriers that we've heard through those prior workshops. So we're going to be working with a group of parents. We're hoping to have the same group of parents throughout each successive workshop. So I think move to this slide here. We're going to be ultimately dividing, there's going to be 9 workshops, but ultimately I'm trying to get about 30 to 35 parents in each one of these workshops. So we've got an English workshop, a workshop conducted in Spanish, and then a workshop that will be a dual language workshop, which might end up being about 2 hours, because if we do dual language consecutively, it takes a little bit longer, but also was incredibly important to our design team to offer multiple opportunities for parents to be able to engage. One of the big questions that our parents weighed in on was the notion of recruitment for these workshops. Did we want to make this as inclusive as possible, be able to invite all parents to be able to participate? Or did we want to potentially, I think with a kind of an equity lens, focus on communities that have had disproportionate impact in terms of population loss, where probably the brunt of the enrollment crisis has been felt most deeply. And we landed on kind of a hybrid approach where we will have kind of a citywide net that we will cast for each of these workshops, but each workshop is then going to break out into regional breakout rooms. So we're going to have a Northwest, a West, a South, and a Southwest to ultimately be able to understand, are the experiences that are being felt in North Lawndale or Austin or Garfield Park, respectively, but also potentially as a region on the west side of Chicago, are those different than what's happening on the southwest side, different than the northwest side, different than the south side? And so, obviously there's going to be themes that we believe will emerge through each of those discussions that will be common, and that will be citywide common, but there might be some recommendations that are made specifically to address concerns in certain regions and communities of the city as well. So with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Alex. I will stop sharing and looking forward to having a good Q&A session with folks here today.
So much, Hal. That was fascinating. Yeah, so please, all participants, feel free to drop any questions you've got in the Q&A box. Looks like we have a couple already coming in to kick it off with, but please keep those coming. One question I had, I'll pull a moderator's prerogative and ask a question that was in my head first. We at To and Through worked for a couple years on a report looking at community-based outcomes for students. So our traditional online tool looks at outcomes for students in different high schools. We just last year released a tool on our website, a public tool that looks at outcomes for students grouped by which communities those students live in. And that was a really enlightening process for us to go through, looking at data in that way that we're not used to disaggregating it by community rather than by school. It sounds like you guys did something similar and did look, you talked about Pilsen Little Village, you talked about different neighborhoods bearing sort of the brunt of the enrollment declines. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those trends at the neighborhood or the community level? Were there any communities that were trends pretty consistent, or were there communities that saw increases in CPS enrollment?
Yeah, I think we certainly saw there's certain areas of the city of Chicago, Belmont Craig being one where we've seen enrollment declines, we've seen population increases. I do think that's probably a little bit of a consequence of gentrification, where families in the northwest side, Logan Square, Humboldt Park, have been pushed kind of further west, which has led to increased population, therefore increased school enrollment in some of those communities. I'll be honest and say that our report really kind of focused on Chicago in the aggregate. We did look at some specific communities, but we didn't go probably that next level of deeper looking into health outcomes or obviously the tool that you guys put out was incredibly informative in terms of looking at education outcomes on a community level basis. But I think one of the goals with this kind of next iteration of this report, because we're going to be able to touch about 100 parents this workshop process, is we would like to be able to at the end of this, and would encourage folks that are interested in this to raise their hand if they're interested in not only participating as a partnership, but also in potentially using such a tool, but would be to ultimately produce kind of a dashboard where you could see kind of census level indicators and to look at those changes over time. That's something that doesn't exist, I think, in kind of the Chicago kind of demographic ecosystem, or much less the education ecosystem, but I think would be a fascinating tool for quality of life planning work happening in communities to kind of understand what are some of the changes that are happening with kind of the key indicators. So homeownership was one that we looked at very closely because we saw that as being an indicator of a community being ripe for gentrification or being vulnerable, I think, to gentrification. But I think it'd behoove, I think it'd be a great asset to the overall ecosystem to have something that would look at key indicators and looking at those changes over time. Demographic changes as well, but some life outcome changes over time. Education outcomes would certainly be a factor there. But I think that's, we didn't kind of drill down in the report into a specific community. We highlighted a few that we saw disproportionate enrollment declines, but we didn't kind of have like an exhaustive cataloging of all 77 community areas and understanding how those outcomes have changed and how those might have an impact on enrollment as well.
Yeah, very fair. Makes sense. Let's see, we've got a few questions from the audience. There's been some focus in the media on blackout migration that's emphasized violence as one of the major motivators. Did you all see any evidence of that in your research?
I think, our position is, violence is not a root cause, right? I think, we want to look at what are the root causes of why someone might perpetrate a crime. And, that kind of takes us back to some of the kind of the main reasons that we identified in the report. Certainly economic opportunity being, first and foremost. And so I do think that, when we have conversations with our parents, because this has come up even in conversations with parents in our network, crime and crime rates certainly have been introduced as an issue. I don't see us as an organization, developing like a 10-point, crime plan as part of the outcome of the second report. I think our emphasis would be, how do we address, we don't believe that anyone is, predisposed to commit a crime or to commit a violent crime. It is an outcome of, a lack of economic opportunity, a lack of potentially social supports, and a whole other, litany of other potential reasons. And so I think we'd want to spend our time kind of addressing some of those root cause issues, as opposed to, a policy plan around community policing or, potential other policing strategies, or redirecting resources to non-policing, to mental health strategies. That could be, but that's how it's being. We'll see ultimately where our parents take us, because that has come up certainly as an issue, as being a reason for why people have left the city.
Sort of a broad question. Is it realistic to reverse the enrollment declines, or are we just now really talking about slowing or stopping these declines?
I think, that's ultimately going to be a question that we'll talk about with our parents. I think, it would not be an overnight situation. I think, the hope is that, through sustained progress, I think not only by our public sector, but by our private sector partners as well, by the civic community, to address those barriers or those reasons, those issues that are causing families to not have children at the higher rates, right? Again, there's some positive reasons behind that. I think, for all of us that are parents, we saw the benefit of the earned the tax credit that was received for childcare tax credit that went away. I think there's been efforts by the state of Illinois and potentially even by the city to explore, kind of bring something like that back. If we can make having childcare more attainable, more affordable, does that make parents want to have more kids? I think that there's a question there. That takes time, obviously, to potentially to realize. I think, one of the things that stuck out to me, I think there was a WBZ article that talked about how in 2020, there was more mortgage lending to white families in Lincoln Park than to Black families throughout the entire city of Chicago. Wow. Which was just a galling stat, and one where, I think we kind of talked about systemic racism in our city, but in our country. Even if the intent is not there, that it shows you just how the system is not designed right. And so I think one of the things that we're really going to be pushing in our report is not just to look at the public sector and to say, what could the public sector be doing differently, but what can we do as a civic community and as a private sector as well, to stem the tide, to change some of these systemic barriers that are causing folks not to be able to. If you can't own a home in Chicago, you're probably going to be looking somewhere else eventually to live. And so that is, I don't think any of these solutions are going to bring back families overnight, but I think if we can address these systematically one by one, and probably have it couched in kind of a broader marketing campaign of, hey, Chicago is an amazing, we all live in the city. It's an incredible resource. We have tremendous parks, libraries. We've seen, the quality of the schools dramatically increase over the last 20 plus years. how do we kind of sell the city, I think, to not only to current Chicagoans to help to encourage them to stay, but ultimately to folks who might have left or people who might be considered to move to Chicago. And so I think it's going to take time. But I think, as a colleague over at Big Shoulders Fund, Joshua Hale, who kind of said, this has the potential to kind of be like a Burnham type plan of like, how do we kind of all together collectively working with our energies to keep families here, but to also make Chicago kind of the destination for families to raise children as well.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. Speaking of sort of systemic issues or barriers, we've gotten some questions on how these implications around smaller numbers of students, what implications might that have for like the number of schools in the city? I'm sure you're getting a lot of questions related to school closures or even just the structure of the district. And especially knowing that, we're seeing this Blackout migration, and a lot of the communities that are bearing sort of the brunt of the enrollment declines are historically Black communities, which could then lead to even fewer resources in those communities. And would that just cause sort of a spiraling effect?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the 2013 school closures had an impact on Blackout migration. It was certainly cited, and we heard that from kind of evidence by exit interview conversations with families. University of Chicago has done a tremendous report. I know several years ago that looked at just the academic adverse academic impact of those closures, both for students who were at those closing schools, but also the students at the receiving schools. For the economic side of it, for CPS, I think it's a challenging situation, but there's, the schools might come off the district's books, but ultimately there's still a negative value to having an empty school sitting in a community that is kind of a reminder of a process that was not terribly community driven in terms of the decisions that were made to close those schools. And so I think there has been examples where a community, and I kind of think about Inglewood as kind of being the one that kind of comes to mind, where the community kind of came together and called for a closure of a subset of the high schools, but then a reimagining kind of the building and the creation of a new high school that is, for all intents and purposes, you had 400 students that enrolled at those 4 high schools, and now I think you had about 500 students in the freshman class at Inglewood STEM High School. And so I think there's certainly an opportunity to pursue those types of actions, but that's a community decision. That's not a CPS decision. That's a community decision ultimately. I think, what we will be seeing in the next report is we're not going to kind of broach, the issue of what CPS should or should not do in terms of having community level conversations about the impact of lower enrollment. But I think, it's important to continue to highlight what the student experience is like for students at some of those smaller schools. But there might be students that are really, really happy being in that type of environment, right? Being in a 60 or 80 student environment. I know that there's a couple of schools that I visited back when I was at CPS that they were just, the teachers were happy, the students were happy. It was a very positive environment, and the community was happy. And so I think that there's an obligation that CPS has to those families and those taxpayers to ensure that they're providing them with an education option that best meets their needs as well.
Thinking a little bit about the inverse in a way, have you seen any data, or did you guys look at any data on how many people are moving into Chicago from other states or other cities? And do we have any ideas as to what is drawing them in as we think about ways to draw more families? It's
hard with migration to data to kind of like pinpoint exactly where did someone move from, necessarily to come into the city. I think it's a positive that we continue to see Latinx AO population continuing to rise in Chicago, even with that declining in migration from Mexico. I don't know if that's directly, from a Latin American country directly to here, if the, folks maybe came to a surrounding suburb before moving into the city. But no, I mean, we didn't take a closer look at sort of the populations that are coming to Chicago. I think we were all happy to see that Chicago's population overall certainly went up from 2010 to 2020, which had been certainly a vastly different from the 2000s to 2010.
And as you guys are thinking about these strategies, especially in the second portion of the report, are there any places, you said this is really a nationwide trend and most major cities are seeing declines. Is there anywhere we can learn from? Are there any sort of like bright spots where public schools are really thriving and seeing increased enrollment, or cities are?
Yeah, no, it's an
drawing more
interesting
people?
point because in the aggregate, actually, public school enrollment from I think it was about 2000 until 2018 or 19 had actually gone up. The percentage, so the percentage market share overall of students attending public schools had gone up across the entire country. Again, I don't know if there's been kind of a short-term change in that as a result of the pandemic, but the market share in the aggregate for public schools was increasing. Same time, enrollment was decreasing. So I think it was about 1 million students had been a decline overall across, I think it was like 74 million to 73 million in terms of students that were in public school, but their market share was actually increasing over that kind of 2-decade period. I don't see an example of a large urban school district reversing the trend of enrollment declines. Unfortunately, it's probably been more steeper declines actually even than Chicago public schools. I think LA has taken a particular hit over the last couple of years, New York as well, which kind of gives me hope that Chicago can kind of create a little bit of a blueprint that could be utilized by other school districts, but certainly other cities as well. So I'm excited about the conversation of, again, a partnership with our public sector entities, but also our private sector and our kind of civic community to potentially have a sustained effort to address the barriers that are kind of causing this decline. That could be a blueprint that could be utilized by other cities and school districts around the country as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We got a related question around the focus groups. Are you planning to talk to any families about what's keeping them in CPS, or are there schools that, enrollment has increased and have attracted families? What are they doing differently?
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration. Education will certainly be, to all of the parents on our network particularly are very motivated to talk about education issues as being both kind of the positives and the negatives, certainly. And so we're kind of working through the process of kind of broadening folks' minds kind of outside the education sector, since we are a K-12 education advocacy organization. But yes, I think understanding, the experiences that parents have had, in terms of high quality teaching and great principal at a school, like what have been some of the reasons for why we've been able to, how we've been able to boost enrollment in certain schools. But we also don't want to necessarily, we need to grow our N, right? We need to grow our number of school-age children in the city of Chicago. Thinking about strategies that might, kind of move kids around is I think an important consideration. And if we can have, every school that kind of offers what is drawing some families to certain schools, every school kind of having the same kind of opportunity to make that draw, I think would be a huge positive impact on Chicago. But that'll certainly, I think, be a focus of kind of that workshop 1, but also even kind of workshop 2, as we kind of go deeper into folks' experiences with some of these kind of topics and some of these areas as well.
So on that note about sort of moving around resources, we got a couple questions related. Schools are clearly affected by a lot of these declines in enrollment, but they're not always able to drive the dynamics you're talking about, like birth rates, migration, employment. No. Should policymakers start thinking about decoupling student numbers from school funding?
I think it's an interesting question. I think it's come up a lot. I think even with, the most recent CPS budget process and kind of knowing that, this continuous decline is coming until we start to stem the tide. I'm a believer that still that ultimately, if you want to make sure that the students with the highest needs are getting the most resources, a student-based budgeting system is the best way to do so. I think you could probably argue about certainly is CPS's current school-based budgeting is, the state's evidence-based funding formula, is it granular enough? Are there enough kind of weights and kind of levers to make sure that the funding is going to students most in need? But, ultimately kind of, moving to a model, back to the model of like a position allocation model where it's just, X number of students in a classroom and you give a teacher, per that number of students. I don't know if that gets to equity, right? That's kind of more of like, every kind of school, every classroom gets the same. And ultimately you're not able to put more resource into students that need it the most. So I'd be curious to kind of see like what a hybrid approach might be, where maybe there's a higher level of maybe base funding, and then kind of everything that gets added on that kind of base funding is, based on, a student's IEP status, English language learner status, community hardship, like what are the factors? And I think we should be having a community conversation, a city conversation about what are those kind of prioritization of factors that students should be getting more resources, to accommodate their unique needs. But I think it's unless there's going to be a wholesale transformation at the state level to reverse EBF, or evidence-based funding formula, which is driven by enrollment at the district level, I don't see, a decoupling probably, coming present in our future.
Across all the research that you did for this report and writing the report, was there one finding or one result that really stood out to you or surprised you?
I think it would have to probably be around Black employment rates. I think was one, just how staggering that gap was for Cook County Black residents versus the other races and ethnicities. I think also I think the promise and the hope of many families who've left have just not traveled that far. I think there had been a perception sometimes in the media that this kind of, and when I say it, like reverse Great Migration, is kind of like a return to the South. And the reality was that many of the families, the residents, are staying in and around Chicago, Northwest Indiana, Southeast Wisconsin. So I think that gives a promise, that gives a hope that for folks that have been here, that have experienced Chicago, that know all the advantages and the resources our city has and comparative to other places, that is one that I think, speaks to the promise of potentially bringing those families back. I think one thing that we saw was, families who went to surrounding counties or suburbs, they weren't necessarily getting a higher wage. Like the average wages in those counties or suburbs was lower than what Chicago was, but they just weren't getting employed in Chicago. And so we're hopeful that by addressing potentially the employment factor and knowing that there's a higher wage rate in Chicago compared to some of the surrounding areas, that we might be able to recruit those families back and ultimately bring more school-age children back to the city of Chicago as well.
A question around if we're able to see trends in when families are leaving CPS, especially around grade levels. So do we see that there are certain like cutoffs related to grade levels when families seem to leave the most?
It's been heavily at the kindergarten level. So I mean, it's the entry grade. And so I think, if you, CPS, to their credit, they produced, I think, a very transparent report back in October, November, I think of 2021, presented to the Board of Education that kind of broke down like what these changes of grade level enrollment have been over the last 3 to 4 years. And it's kindergarten, it's pre-K and it's kindergarten. And so you're just kind of setting yourself up for this kind of structural, difference where, again, going back to the stat about, 33,000 in kindergarten students in 2009, now down to 22,000 in 2019. It's just continuing to shrink. And so you might see that, high school is doing just fine, but it's just each incremental year, each successive year, just the kind of compounding effect is taking a toll, certainly on enrollment of the entire system.
That's really interesting. I think there's sort of like an anecdote or a myth maybe that it happens like the high school level, that 8th to 9th transition is when people are sort of decamping to the suburbs. So that's really interesting to hear that it's actually much earlier.
Yeah.
Let's see, a question around COVID circumstances. Family departures due to COVID circumstances like remote learning, hybrid, work stoppages, vaccination masking requirements, anything that came up around those things?
I think it's something that the census data that we had available to us at that point, it was up to 2019. So we didn't get to look at the impacts of COVID. I think, all schools were closed for the latter half of spring 2020. And so it was really kind of like that fall 2020 was when there was the potential for some students to be able to go back to in-person, whereas some students, certainly all CPS students were remote until I think it was January, February for pre-K. Elementary, I think, was March, and then high school was shortly after spring break of last school year. We haven't gotten our hands on the most recent census data to be able to unpack that. I think we've seen certainly state level data. I think Illinois, there was a decline in public school enrollment that was much higher, I think, from that 2020 to 2021 school year. We've seen certainly some national trends. I think the question is that going to stick, right? Did families make a choice? Did they go parochial? Did they go homeschool? Ultimately, and is that are those families going to stay at those schools? Are they potentially going to come back? But I think, it kind of loses sight of one of the main things that we saw. And again, you can look this up in CPS's data that's publicly available, is that yes, there was a significant uptick of families going to homeschool, like the reasons for why students transferred. It might have gone from 1,500 the year before in 2019 were homeschooled, now it's 3,000. Transferred to a non-public option might have been another significant increase, maybe 100% increase, but it would have been maybe like 2,000 to 4,000. But the number of students who left Chicago was like 18,000. So just a much higher. So like I think we can keep talking about like COVID, the impact, but it is because people are leaving the city is ultimately the reason why why we're seeing the enrollment decline. So there's, again, those kind of uptick, certainly in some of those other areas, homeschool, people pursuing non-public options, but it's really leaving the city that's the main driver behind the enrollment decline.
Question around the graph that showed percentage of students not enrolled. So there was a decline in the not enrolled share of school-age kids. I'll give you a second.
Caught me.
So it looks like that white piece all the way on the right of the bar, there's a decline in that not enrolled. Is that coming from more students enrolled in like the primary childhood grades, or are fewer students dropping out of high school? Do we know what's driving that decrease?
I think it's probably a combination of fewer homeschooled and fewer dropping out would be. And again, this is a census kind of American Community Survey data. It's saying, so someone checking a box and saying, yes, I have a school-age child. No, they're not enrolled in a public or non-public option. So a little bit harder, I think, to kind of unpack, what, like, I won't say like the market share of those non-enrolled kids are. Like, are they homeschooled? Or are they just not in school at all? But that's one that I would actually, I'm guessing if we looked at 2020 or 2021, there'd probably be a slightly increase, I think, as a result of the pandemic in that particular category.
A follow-up question to the former question about when families tend to leave the district. Do you think increased options for preschool and the new application system will change that sort of outflow at the kindergarten level? For example, now that students are more likely to be admitted to their neighborhood school for preschool, that sort of hook them into the system.
I think it's, everything that I've seen from CPS in terms of the pre-K guidelines and the kind of enrollment policy changes, I think are very promising and very parent friendly, right? I think in this year's cycle, I saw, and I say this as a parent of a 7-year-old CPS student and a 3-year-old who's going to be, eventually entering CPS, but the ability to have prioritization to go to your neighborhood school in terms of the pre-K process, the ability to have sibling preference, I think is a big one, right? All of us with little kids, like if you got to drop off a kid at one building, like that can maybe make your decision right there for you. So I'm hopeful that with more of these kind of family-friendly enrollment practices and policies, that'll just make more families want to stay within the system, because I still would probably have a bone to pick about the enrollment, the timeline and the cycle. I think it'd be great if they could kind of align all of the enrollment cycles to that kind of like December timeframe, so then parents had more assurance kind of going into the spring and the summer that they were enrolled in a pre-K program. But I do think that having this kind of seamless transition where you join a school community as part of the pre-K experience, and you have a higher preference or ability to stay in that school going to kindergarten, you become more, kind of a part of the overall school community, I think is certainly a positive.
Yeah, definitely changes your perspective when you're going through it for yourself personally. I think we've got time for one more question. How is the report, if at all, going to handle different sort of school types, like options, classical, magnet, gifted? Are you doing any sort of disaggregation or looking at parents in different types of schools specifically?
I think one of the things that we've certainly identified is that the impact of the lower enrollment is affecting all school types. So this is not like, oh, this is only affecting district managed schools. This is disproportionately affecting charter schools. It's affecting option schools. And so we've seen, it's everyone is seeing a lower enrollment that's being caused by this decline in school-age children. I do think that, there could certainly, and I'm not going to be the driver of what parents are kind of identifying as barriers, but I do think that the question of choice will probably come up, certainly in those conversations. And just, I'm certainly a believer that CPS has a lot of choice right now in terms of different school options. I don't think that we're, potentially losing families because of a lack of choice. In some ways, we maybe have too much choice, but that will certainly be kind of on the table to discuss as, I think, as a barrier, but also something that potentially promote for a reason for why students or why families should stay in the city. I think, we are pretty unique as a city that we offer all these academic programmings, international baccalaureate, STEM, STEAM, fine arts, all these kind of gifted programs. We have a plethora of options that are available, traditional schools, charter schools, different school day lengths, different school years. There's a lot of choice in this district. So I think I think that'll be something that we certainly, I think, kind of bring up as something. Do parents want to pursue that as as a plus, as a minus, certainly as we continue the conversations around recommendations to ultimately make Chicago a more family-friendly city for folks to live in.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for presenting and for this super interesting research that you all are pursuing. We are going to hop over to another, I believe we're going to drop in chat the link to another Zoom room so that we can get out of presentation mode and into just a regular Zoom room where we can all chat and discuss what we heard over the last hour. Yes, so I think that just appeared in chat. So we're hoping that everybody will join us there. Very informal, definitely low pressure. Just come hang out and talk about, we had so many great questions. Clearly this has sparked a lot of interest for people. So we hope to see you over in that Zoom room at 3 o'clock.